Since thinking began, this creature called man made use of it mostly for fancying folly. He passed through an eerie, odd myth-making period, chopping up monotheism to poly. Then down Gadareno, especially Zeno. Secure in his dream of resolving a poser, he slithered and ran from poly to pan, viz. Wordsworth, Blavatsky, Shaw, Buddha, Spinoza. So I, being an idiot, spilled soda all over my floor the other day. Luckily, I had public goods soap that I could use, and I knew it wouldn't be harsh and gross either on my skin as I got down and scrubbed on the floor or on the floor itself, which is actually pretty nice wood floor. So I didn't want to mess any of that up, and I knew that public goods stuff was always going to be full of the best ingredients. None of these like crazy chemicals that you can't pronounce. You never know what's in the stuff that you get at the grocery store. And a lot of it can actually be just really bad for you. Public goods fixes that problem. And they are also just so lovely to look at. The stuff that they make is always packaged really beautifully. It looks great on your, kitchen counter or in your cupboard or wherever. I mean, they make so many different kinds of things. I've mentioned before, I really love their snacks, their chocolate covered almonds in particular. But they have teas that are really good. They've got, just household basics like shampoo and I mentioned the soap. It's kind of like a one-stop shop for everything that you might need. You have a great deal available to you as a Young Heretics listener, which is that you get $15 off your first public goods order with no minimum purchase. So when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics, that's PUBLICGOODS.com/heretics, you get $15 of free stuff, which is just kind of a no-brainer. publicgoods.com/heretics to get all of this great stuff. All right, once again, I begin with a poem by Owen Barfield. This one from a copy of C.S. Lewis's Miracles that was owned by Barfield, and he had written this poem on the back inside cover, which tells you something about how carefully the two of them engage with one another's work. And I cited this one both to show you the range of Barfield's poetry. Some of it was kind of silly and a little limericky, and some of it was a bit more profound. It's not my favorite part of his work, I have to confess. His poetry, I think he was a better scholar and thinker than he was a poet, a better observer of poetry than practitioner. But this one's pretty good. Some of these references might be a little obscure. Since thinking began, this creature called man made use of it mostly for fencing folly. He passed through an eerie, odd myth-making period, chopping up monotheism to poly. His argument here is that monotheism is kind of the original human state, and then you get these idolatries or polytheisms, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today, which is why I brought it up. Then down Gadareno. This refers to the Gadarenes, the demons that send the hogs hurtling off a cliff. So down Gadareno, like hurtling off a cliff. Especially Zeno, secure in his dream of resolving a poser, he slithered and ran from poly to pan. A poser is a question, not somebody who poses, right? And from poly to pan is not from polysexual to pansexual, but from polytheism to pantheism, vis-a-vis Wordsworth, Blavatsky, Shaw, Buddha, Spinoza, just listing off these kind of gelatinous. We talked last week about the gelatinous amorphous idea of God. And so this is the kind of seemingly sophisticated, but actually regressive way that humanity, as it develops a clearer sense of quote unquote the spiritual as distinct from the physical, moves off away from what it calls anthropomorphic, primitive ideas like Sky Daddy and into ideas of the force or the spirit, right? That's the pantheism of it. So let me begin by taking up a last piece of the passage from Lewis's Miracles, which I ended with last week. And I'm going to sort of keep moving on through this one, through that passage, so that we can jump off and remind ourselves where we are. We're talking here about Owen Barfield, dear friend of C.S. Lewis, first and last, Inkling, and in my view, one of the great neglected writers of the 20th century. Much of his work is key for understanding how we can reconcile some of the crises of thought that are occurring in the scientistic age. All right, here's Lewis before we get back into Barfield. At this stage, I must turn aside to deal with a rather simple-minded illusion. When we point out that what the Christians mean is not to be identified with their mental pictures, some people say, in that case, would it not be better to get rid of the mental pictures and of the language which suggests them altogether? But this is impossible. The people who recommend it have not noticed that when they try to get rid of man-like, or as they are called, anthropomorphic images, they merely succeed in substituting images of some other kind. I don't believe in a personal God, says one, but I do believe in a great spiritual force. What he has not noticed is that the word force has let in all sorts of images about winds and tides and electricity and gravitation. I don't believe in a personal God, says another, but I do believe we are all parts of one great being which moves and works through us all, not noticing that he has merely exchanged the image of a fatherly and royal-looking man for the image of some widely extended gas or fluid. A girl I knew was brought up by higher-thinking parents to regard God as perfect substance. In later life, she realized that this had actually led her to think of him as something like a vast tapioca pudding. To make matters worse, she disliked tapioca. We may feel ourselves quite safe from this degree of absurdity, but we are mistaken. If a man watches his own mind, I believe he will find that what profess to be specially advanced or philosophic conceptions of God are, in his thinking, always accompanied by vague images, which, if inspected, would turn out to be even more absurd than the man-like images aroused by Christian theology. For man, after all, is the highest of the things we meet in sensuous experience. He has at least conquered the globe, honored, though not followed, virtue, achieved knowledge, made poetry, music, and art. If God exists at all, it is not unreasonable to suppose that we are less unlike him than anything else we know. We're going to come back to that with a quote from Thomas Aquinas later on in this episode. Less unlike him than anything else we know. No doubt we are unspeakably different from him to the extent that all man-like images are false. To that extent, all man-like images are false, but those images of shapeless mists and irrational forces which, unacknowledged, haunt the mind when we think we are rising to the conception of impersonal and absolute being must be very much more so, for images of the one kind or the other will come. We cannot jump off our own shadow. This is the genius of Lewis, of course, condensing extremely complex ideas into eloquent and digestible prose, not Barfield's strength, but we will revisit now some of what Barfield has said about this very idea that we cannot jump off our own shadow. Last week, we talked all about it in language. Now we're going to come back to this idea of the inescapability of a union between form and matter in perception in Barfield's book, Saving the Appearances. One of the worst things about how political everything has become is that so many brands have gone woke, and now in order just to get a drink, you have to sign up for this crazy woke garbage. Gold River Trading Company fixes that problem. If you're tired of buying from people who hate you, if you're tired of, giving money to people that endorse the craziest, most bonkers cockamamie nonsense, like transing the kids or whatever, go to goldriverco.com to check out Gold River tea. The nice thing about this, besides the fact that they are not crazy, is that they're actually good. Gold River Trading Company's tea is like the best that I've had this side of the Atlantic. They now have a pumpkin spice flavor, which is doing its part to fight back against the anti-pumpkin spice hate. If you are wondering what side I stand on the great pumpkin spice divide, it is the side of, I don't really drink pumpkin spice that much, but I thoroughly support and endorse doing so. And Gold River's pumpkin spice is actually really good. Like everything they make, it's artisanal and well constructed. I particularly love their American breakfast blend. And I love that they are pro-freedom, pro-America, Christian, and anti-cancel culture. Go to goldriverco.com and you can save 15%. They upped that percent. You can save more now when you go to goldriverco.com and use the discount code Heretics, Heretics, at goldriverco.com. So this is from my book, How to Save the West. It's not out yet, but you can pre-order it on Amazon or wherever you get your books. I hope you will. I think you're going to like it. I think if you like this show, you are going to love How to Save the West. It's called subtitle is Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. It takes 5 kind of parcels of news items, things that we talk about a lot, argue about a lot in the news, tries to uncover some of the kind of deeper questions and the history of those questions, so that we can have tools for understanding and engaging with a lot of the problems that we're facing today. And this is from a passage in which I start talking about these kind of Barfieldian. So Saving the Appearances, remember Barfield's later and in some ways more mature work than Poetic Diction, although Poetic Diction, as I've already said at some length, is pretty phenomenal. This one is, I think, captures some more of Barfield's wider vision of life, the universe, and everything, man's relationship to the outside world, which is contained implicitly in poetic diction, which really gets spelled out in Saving the Appearances. On the one hand, he writes, the word conceived in the mind is representative of the whole of that which is realized in thought. This is from Aquinas. We're going to come back to that later. But on the other hand, the phenomenon itself only achieves full reality in the moment of being named by man. That is, when that in nature, which it represents, is united with that in man, which the name represents. Such naming, however, need not involve vocal utterance, for the name or word is not mere sound or mere ink. For Aquinas, as for Augustine, there are, anterior to the uttered word, the intellect word, the heart word, and the memory word, verbum intellectus, verbum cordis, verbum memoriae. The human word proceeds from the memory as the divine word proceeds from the Father, proceeds from it, yet remains one with it. For the world is the thought of God realized through his word. I said last week that Barfield's favorite quote from the gospel is John 1, right? That in the beginning was the word. And this passage, now that we've spent some time with poetic diction, can show us how Barfield understands the human conscious experience of matter. This is what I've been promising to get to for a while now, because when we talk about material science, and this is Barfield's great insight that kind of kicks off Saving the Appearances. When we talk about material science, we have this fallacy that we are talking about a God's eye view of the world. And by God's eye view, what I mean is we're talking about the objective picture of how the material world works without our senses, without the mediation of our senses. And we accomplish this trick. We play this trick upon ourselves by reducing things to numbers, right? We say, well, they have this chart and table, this, spike of serotonin here, a measurement of rainfall there, everything that we can write down in cold ones and zeros or cold numbers more generally, we imagine to have described in a way that bears no relationship to our conscious experience, which you might call the qualia of things, the qualitative way that the outside world affects our inner life and our experience. And yet, one of the seminal findings of science in the last 100 years has been precisely that this is an illusion. This idea that we're getting a God's eye view, a third-person objective view of the outside world when we measure things, when we chart patterns and identify forces, material forces in the world, automatic forces in the world. That idea turns out to be false, or at least highly oversimplified, because what happens when you look away from something, when there is no observer? It turns out, as Kant could have told you before the quantum physicists told you, right? It turns out we have no clue, because, of course, everything that we do, even when we measure things, even when we, observe patterns in them and learn how to manipulate matter more effectively, everything refers to some human experience, ultimately, that we are having of the world. Even when we get down to particles, right? We think that by getting down very small, we can avoid this and, find some objectivity in quarks and subatomic particles, right? And bosons and all this stuff. And yet, those two refer only and everywhere to experiences that some human has had of some measuring device that is affected by some outside thing. Going, again, kind of crib noting Kant here, there is an outside world. Don't mistake me to be saying that the outside world is purely what our consciousness makes of it. There is an outside world. We can't just will it into total rearrangement. And it will behave in certain ways, irrespective of our desires or involvement with it. However, when we start to say that the outside world looks like or is like this or that, absent our perception, we have fallen into an error. We have words like look like don't mean anything when you're talking about something that is unobserved, things that happened before the existence of human consciousness, things that happen outside the realm of human consciousness and experience. And this is the quantum physics paradox or the difficulty of things like the wave function in light, right? For light and for particles, that when you say of something that, is it a particle or a wave? Well, it's both and neither until observed. What you basically mean is that you only know how to describe or experience it when you're observing it, when the outside world is having some effect upon you. Why is this related to poetic diction? Because similarly, right, there is no, if words have a meaning that goes beyond any encapsulation in matter, if a tree is some form that is far beyond our physical experience of the tree, then we have never had a direct face-to-face encounter with that formal tree, right? All we've ever had is a sensory encounter with how that outside thing affects us. And Barfield's argument here is that's all of human life and experience. We always do that. We always have an encounter with the outside world that affects us in certain sensory ways. And that is how they come to us, is mediated through the senses. And our use of language, Barfield is arguing in this passage, is our way of formalizing and finalizing that relationship that we have with the outside world. Once we've given a name to something, then we have crystallized it in our minds and in our experience into the thing that it was made to be, which is a thing in relationship with a consciousness, with a conscious mind, ultimately with God's conscious mind. And this is why we refer to the view of things in their objective state as the God's eye view, because even in the sort of final analysis of what things are, there's some consciousness that is observing them and bringing them into being according to the scriptural account, right? That God speaks and there is light and he sees and it is good. The seeing is really important here, right? What does all of this have to do with something like the multiverse? And I'm going to bring up the multiverse because this is the thing that I am most interested in, but there are a range of problems in modern physics that have this same kind of structure. But the multiverse is a good way of starting to think about it, because let me just back up and give you a little bit of, crib notes on how multiverse theory tends to work in modern physics. So in modern physics, you have at least two major ways of arguing that we live in a multiverse, not just one universe, but many different universes branching off of each other. And they're designed to answer or resolve two separate problems. The first one is the problem or the question of what's called fine-tuning. And this is the fact that many of the constants that we observe in physics, right, are minutely calibrated. They're within very, very small ranges of the possible values that could support conscious life. Things like the configuration of mass and energy at the beginning of the universe, and the charges between certain particles, certain subatomic particles, right? The force of attraction. These things are exactly what they need to be in order for life to exist. And it turns out that they don't have to be that way, so far as we can tell. There's no philosophical reason why they have to be this way. One way of answering that question that does not invoke God, right? Because scientists are loath to invoke God as an explanation for things, right? So if it's not God, if it's not what Fred Hoyle, the astrophysicist, called a super intellect that has monkeyed with the universe, maybe it's just that there's lots of different universes, and this just happens to be the one where the conditions are right for life. And this is where you get what is called the string inflationary landscape model, or string inflationary cosmology. And the idea here is, again, speaking very generally, right, string theory describes the universe as minutely small vibrating strings, which vibrate to produce the laws of physics. Perhaps those configurations of strings decay, and then as the universe expands, there develop new pockets where the configuration of strings is different, and the laws of physics are different, and these constants would therefore be different, and so would the initial conditions of the universe, right? So the problem with this is that we have no evidence for it, except that there are many different solutions to the equations of string theory. So the idea is here, well, maybe all of those equations describe different universes, and ours is the one that happens to apply to, one set of equations, but all these other sets of equations describe other universes. But there's no experiment that observes, right, these other bubbles of the string theory space, right, bubbling up in these other parts of the universe making machine. It also doesn't answer the God question, because somebody would have had to make the string inflationary landscape anyway, but that's sort of a separate point too. This is a very fanciful idea, and most people that encounter it will acknowledge that, like, you have to invent a bunch of stuff or postulate a bunch of things that not only have we never seen, we never could see. They could never be observed, right? So that's one sort of multiverse model. The other one is designed to resolve exactly the ambiguity that I was just talking about in terms of our perception of the world. When you look away from things, you have no idea, no way of knowing, right, what things are like, because things are only like anything to a conscious mind, right? And so the fact that, for instance, when you pass photons, that is the quanta of light, the particles of light, through a half-silvered mirror, half of them bounce off one way, half of them pass through, right? And it turns out, in fact, that they seem to behave in ways that suggest they actually bounce. They both bounce and pass through until they are observed, right? This is you can do various experiments where you pass light through a half-silvered mirror, and it looks like they take both of the possible paths until you observe them, and then 50% take one, 50% take the other, so on and so forth. How can this possibly be? How can we wrap our heads around this without giving some role to consciousness? Because a theist is actually quite comfortable saying, well, consciousness has a role, right, in the construction of reality. That's why God makes man last and invites him to give names to the animals, right? We can see with our mind, with our consciousness, and we therefore give this finalizing cap to reality. So reality has an existence outside of us, but it's sort of amorphous or indescribable or beyond, the categories of our mind before we observe it. Then when we observe it, we bring this kind of finalizing order to it. And that's why Barfield talks about the organizing feature of consciousness, not just as like language that we use, but the things that the language represents, right? The language, the words that we use represent these concepts in our mind, and the concepts themselves are sort of structured by the way our mind itself works. We can't even help it. We just look at things and they resolve, right? Another example of this is like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? That you can't, you can measure the velocity of something, but then you can't know its location. You can measure its location, but then you can't know its momentum, and so on and so forth, right? So when we perform these observations, we seem to actually have an effect upon things. And that effect is exactly the effect that you would predict if you were a Barfieldian and a theist, which is to say it's the effect of finally consummating an otherwise indeterminate reality. If you don't like that, then the other thing that you can say, and this was kind of Schrodinger, didn't like it very much. The other thing that you can say is, well, actually, all of these possibilities that are described by the quantum equations are happening at once in separate universes. And let me read to you the way that this plays out in the book of a guy that I quite like, have enjoyed, David Deutsch. This is The Beginning of Infinity. And the book, I've read before from the book in a sort of positive light. Now I'm going to read from it in a negative light. So Deutsch here is talking about the half-silvered mirror, which, again, when photons pass through such mirrors, they either bounce out off the mirror or they pass through the mirror. And they seem to do both when not observed. And then the observation seems to, resolve in some way the path that they are taking. When a photon strikes such a mirror, writes Deutsch, it bounces off in half the universes and passes straight through in the other half. Under the laws of quantum physics, elementary particles are undergoing such processes, that is, the processes of splitting and resolving into different universes and coming back together of their own accord all the time. Moreover, histories may split into more than two, often into many trillions, each characterized by a slightly different direction of motion or difference in other physical variables of the elementary particle concerned. So this is the kind of multiversal way of understanding the quantum indeterminacy, right? Is that actually the things that seem to be going on all at once until we observe them are still going on all at once when we observe them. And this was most sort of famously argued or given mathematical form by this guy, Hugh Everett. Schrodinger sort of suggested it. That's kind of the point of Schrodinger's cat, by the way, right? The cat sits in this box. There's there's a radioactive substance. And if the radioactive substance decays by one atom, then this poison is released and the cat dies. And if you are not looking at the cat, then you can say in quantum physics that one atom of the radioactive substance both has and has not decayed, and therefore the cat is both alive and dead, because these small systems the small systems where quantum weirdness occurs then affect these big systems like cats, right, in boxes. And basically Schrodinger says, well, that doesn't make any sense. So what if the cat is both alive in one universe and dead in another, rather than being kind of indeterminately alive and or dead in the box when we look away. Hugh Everett basically says, essentially the quantum equations describe these multiple states of being, right? And then when we enter into those, the situation, when we make a measurement or we make an observation, then we also are in multiple states of being. One version of us is seeing the cat alive. one version of us is seeing the cat dead. And the cat is actually, to me, not a very good or satisfying experiment because it also has a consciousness. So we don't really know if its consciousness is affecting the way that the universe works. But anyway, the problem with this, for me, is that it still doesn't answer the question, right? If you say quantum measurements cause universes to split off from one another, right? You're still saying there is some role for measurement to play, right, in the physical universe. And you've just kind of kicked the can down the road. It seems beyond that, right? And even on top of that, you're not actually, with the quantum equations, describing something being in two states at once. Sometimes we talk about it this way. I sometimes talk about it this way. But you're actually describing something that is completely beyond our realm of experience or imagination at all. You're talking about things like imaginary numbers, right? Which are involve the square roots of negatives. And the square root of a negative can be used perfectly well in the kind of shut up and calculate model. You can use the square root of a negative to come to all sorts of conclusions. But it doesn't describe anything that we can picture or imagine or know about. So really what the quantum equations are saying is something outside of our consciousness is outside of our consciousness. We have no grasp of it and never can have a grasp of it. And this is why multiverse proposals are always philosophical proposals and never purely scientific proposals. They don't submit themselves to experimental verification. And Deutsch's answer is question begging, right? Because he says, well, we observe these particles doing different things in different universes. Well, no, we don't. We observe one universe, and in that universe, we see evidence of some sort of indeterminacy outside our conscious experience. And either that indeterminacy refers to a kind of indeterminacy just in the world, right, without our conscious engagement with the world, or it refers to multiple universes coming into being at all times. But the argument that I'm making, that I think Barfield is making, is that you don't need the multiverse to explain this. You just need to understand the very nature of our encounter with the world, which is always form in matter, flesh and spirit, right? The kind of resolving of this, spiritual entity that is beyond all time and space, beyond all thought, into a physical reality that has a point in, that has a location in space and in time, almost like an incarnation, right? And this is what I'm arguing and what I've been getting to with all of this Barfield stuff, is that language and our experience of the world and the world itself all has the same structure. They are all structured in exactly this way, that there is such a thing as the spiritual world. There is such a thing as the abstract and the beyond and the metaphysics. And yet, right, we are creatures who only encounter the spiritual, the metaphysical, whatever, in flesh, because that's what we are. That's our role in the universe. We are the expression of God in the world. We are in his image. To me, this is a much more satisfactory way of addressing science, believing all the things that science teaches us, while still reserving the right to acknowledge that science is not giving us this kind of like dead world full of just blocks and objects that move around and particles that bounce off of one another. Our concept of that idea is flawed. There's no such thing, right, as even the experience of something that has no spiritual relationship to us whatsoever. There's only understanding that relationship more fully and grasping how to manipulate the relationships between objects that are not us, and indeed between us and other objects. Let me read to you a passage from my book, that will sort of express part of what I'm saying. Midterms coming up, and the economy is on everybody's mind. The indicators just seem to keep getting worse, and that is why Rocket Money is an essential tool for anybody that wants to get his or her finances locked down these days. If you have noticed these free trials that sort of sneak their way into your credit card bill, you may recall that Truebill helped you to fix that problem. They have now upgraded, new and improved, and they are now called Rocket Money. They still help you to manage and cancel subscriptions you don't need or want. And they also do a bunch of other stuff for over 3.4 million people: budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions. This stuff is really important, man. And not just because we need to be building the young Heretics empire, but because your finances are a major part of how you take care of your family, how you take care of yourself. And Rocket Money is a really great tool, simple and easy for people like me that are kind of dummies when it comes to numbers and finance. I love using it. You can start canceling your unused subscriptions and save money at rocketmoney.com/Heretics. Heretics. One more time, it's rocketmoney.com/heretics. You got to use that link to start canceling your unused subscriptions and dealing with your finances more generally today. rocketmoney.com/heretics. Ideas, just to give you a taste. All languages have form and matter. There is the sound of a word or a sentence, and then there is the meaning it conveys. Words stand in as symbols for a certain range of ideas, and in relationship with one another, they come to express a whole range of complex and subtle thoughts, from "this necklace is made of gold" to "much have I traveled in the realms of gold." The matter of these sentences, the stuff they are made out of, is letters and syllables. But the form which lives within them is what they convey, the images, memories, and associations they evoke. The whole of the universe works like this. It is matter so arranged as to contain form. Like language, the universe is subjective but not arbitrary. When I see light bouncing off the chair in front of me, it hits my eyes in such a way that my mind experiences the color called brown. There is no brown in the atoms of the chair or the photons moving through space, at least not in any sense that I mean when I use the word. The real brown, the visual quality of the thing, is something conveyed to me through and in matter. It is not the matter itself. The atoms of the chair are not in themselves brown any more than the letters CHAIR are brown, any more than the sound I make when I say the word is something solid that can be sat on. But the word conveys to my mind the image, and the matter conveys to my mind the thing as it is to me, not in some abstract or clinical sense of molecular composition, but as a real and tangible entity that I know and relate to, the favorite chair by my bookshelf where the cat sits above my shoulder as I write. There's a little Chad Cat cameo in the book. Everything works this way. The chair, the cat, and the bookshelf are best described not as conglomerate heaps of matter, but as the real and solid entities which their atoms and molecules make in the world, beings with qualities and characters, with relationships to one another. Like language, the material world is not an end in itself, but a pattern, a system of order and rules that give shape to otherwise formless masses of letters, of sounds, of molecules, of flesh. Under a microscope, my chair will show itself to be made of so much synthetic material, various expanses of different metals and threads. I may, if I so choose, imagine those metals and threads as more essential or real than the chair itself. But whoever said that the truest way of looking at a thing was by holding it up an inch from your face? Whoever said that the best way to get the meaning of a word was to look at each of the letters one by one, in isolation from each other? The real essence of things, what they truly are, is best understood at the level of normal human perception. If you want to know what something really is, you get familiar with it in its entirety, as a complete entity, the way you get to know your best friend or your pet rabbit. The tool for reading the language of the universe is not the microscope, but the soul. And the soul, too, is a kind of language, a kind of form in matter, a whole and complete meaning which all the parts of the body express. Your body has consciousness the way a word has meaning. Both are just inert stuff, empty letters, and dry bones until they come together in the right combination and the lights switch on. All right. That's from the book, How to Save the West. There's lots more like that in there, but I thought that was, since I spent some time thinking about how to express the things that I've been arguing over the past 3 weeks in the book, I just wanted to read to you that passage and give you a taste of it. Because this really is, this stuff, when we began talking about it, right, it sort of can feel really abstract. You can start to feel like, well, etymologies, and who really cares about like the Latin word for ruin and whatever. And yet the essence of the thing, the nature of the tripartite nature of the world, right? That there you have form and matter, and you have the relationship between the two. You have Father, you have Son, and you have Holy Spirit, right? The fact that the Trinity is not just like a nice theological idea about God, but actually baked into the structure of everything, right? Everything that matters is Trinitarian. This is like something that we've completely erased from view, and yet none of our thoughts make sense without it. Not even our science makes sense without it, right? When we start talking about, these physical discoveries, and the way we talk about them as if they give us some kind of pure, abstract, God's eye view knowledge of stuff, it just doesn't make any sense, right? So let me read you now, enough of me, let me read you from Aquinas, because this is the passage that Barfield invokes and that I also cite in the book. And this kind of helps us, I think, to grasp the final piece of this puzzle, which is the Trinity piece of the puzzle. Because we've been talking about mostly human stuff so far, right? We've been talking about language, we've been talking about the way that our language reflects our thoughts, the way that our thoughts reflect our perceptions, how our perceptions are different from the way scientism teaches us to think about them. Now let's talk about how this tripartite way we have of experiencing the world, form, matter, and the relationship between them, might be part of the image of God in us, a reflection of who God is in our sort of nature as rational animals. Because if we are in God's image, surely it is as rational animals, right? As self-conscious beings that use language, that see the world in such a way as to produce language, thereby giving final form to an otherwise indeterminate universe. Aquinas, this is the Summa Theologica, which if you're not familiar with Aquinas and you haven't heard me read him before on the show, he is obviously genius Catholic theologian from the medieval era. He writes this massive compendium of answers to like every question you could ever possibly have. Not advisable, in my opinion, to read it start to finish, cover to cover, but rather to dip into it as you have certain questions about certain things. So this is about God as words, about the use of language about God, in the same way that Lewis was talking about it in Miracles. So it's from part 1, question 34, article 3. God, by knowing himself, knows every creature. Now, the word conceived in the mind is representative of everything that is actually understood. This is Barfield's point, right? That when we use language, we're just giving the outward show of something that our mind has already done, which is taking the experiences that we have and giving some final form to them, or giving shape to them. Hence, there are in ourselves different words for the different things which we understand. But because God by one act understands himself and all things, his one only word is expressive not only of the Father, but of all creatures. And as the knowledge of God is only cognitive as regards God, whereas as regards creatures it is both cognitive and operative, so the word of God is only expressive of what is in God the Father, but is both expressive and operative of creatures. And therefore it is said, he spake and they were made. This is from the Psalms. Because in the word is implied the operative idea of what God makes. Now, this is a little bit abstract, this last part, but let me try and unpack what Aquinas is saying, right? He says, the word of God as a person of the Trinity, right, is expressive of his being. That is why the Son is uncreated, right? He's begotten, not made. God, in speaking himself into the world, right, begets Christ, begets Jesus walking and talking. And that is a kind of language, right, a way of a mode of self-expression. But it's not the creation of something that didn't already exists. It's just the permanent state of God, which is why everything is structured this way, why everything has this kind of tripartite form, right? The word is only expressive of what is in God the Father. And then when Aquinas talks about words being operative, he means that they have a kind of effective meaning, right? That they accomplish something. And he says the word is both expressive and operative of creatures. So creatures also, the things that God creates, the fish and the sea, the stars in the sky, the grass, whatever, the earth, right? This is a kind of self-expression of God too. It is the heavens declare the glory of God. It is like a kind of poem, or they express aspects of God. We learn about his goodness from the goodness of food. We learn about his wisdom from the truth of things that we learn and all this stuff. So you get aspects of God expressed in creation, but you also get those things created by God's very utterance, right? That he spake and they were made. And this is also something that there are two functions of language for us too, right? We can describe experiences that we have, but we also give shape to those experiences with language and with the mental function of which language is the kind of outward show. And that is why quantum physics is telling us what it's telling us, is because there is an out there, but it has a certain indeterminacy until our consciousness gives the final capstone to it, gives shape and meaning to it through the forms of language. Just as God creates the world by speaking it into existence, we finalize the world by seeing it and describing it and giving form to it with our consciousness. The maths indicate this. The scientific experiments are telling us this. The only reason to invent another solution to this problem is if you can't bear to accept the notion that, in fact, there is a role for consciousness in the finalization of creation. So let me now read to you another passage that gets at some of these ideas, I think, rather well, if you think about it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. This passage, which is very mysterious, takes on new meaning when you start to think about the kind of Barfieldian approach to quantum physics, or even the Kantian approach to human perception. That what you have in verse 1 and verse 2 is basically the ingredients, a description of the things that go into creation. Earth was formless and empty, right? There is a kind of unformed out there, right? And you have these three aspects of God. You have the God the Father, right, who does the creating. You have the Spirit, which hovers over the surface of the deep, this kind of ineffable thing making contact between God and the void, right? The emptiness, the nothing. And then God said the word, let there be light. God the Father, God the Spirit, God the Word, or God the Son, right? And these three things come together, and in relationship, they make creation, and that creation is a form of speech, right? It's incredibly beautiful when you think about it, and quite philosophically sophisticated, especially once you get to this part, which is after God has created everything and has created man. He says, now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and the wild animals. In some ways, this is the last act of creation, right? Is this? I mean, I guess he's also a great woman, so it's not really the last act of creation, but in time, but it is the kind of consummation of creation. Is mankind's observation of the world, right? And that, in my view, corresponds to the function of human consciousness in resolving the indeterminacy of the outside world, the indeterminacy of matter. And this is why Barfield kind of grasps or understands and begins by talking about our inability to have it both ways. We can't acknowledge that there is this indeterminacy in the world and still talk as if the things outside of our observation have some, behavior or function that we can know and describe, right? We don't have any access to that. We only have this interaction between us and the outside world. The outside world itself is in relationship with the God who speaks it into being. The whole thing is language, and our use of language is in the image of God, the final consummation of creation. Finally, right, we get into the creative role of man in the world, right? Because seeing something is one thing, giving the capstone, the determinacy to creation is one thing, but making things is another, right? And this is something that we can also do. We can observe latent potentialities in things. We can see that something has potential, and then we can bring it into being. And this is a major part of what science helps us do, right? None of this is, when I go off about scientism, right, or the Dr. Fauci's of the world and the reduction of things to matter, right? It's not that I'm against science or have any objection to it at all. I'm really interested in it, actually. I'm not a scientist, but I'm interested in the philosophical questions that science raises. And obviously, I like my iPhone, I'm not like a technological pessimist, as you guys know. And, these sorts of tools that we have developed are great. We just can't confuse them for what they're not. We have this, what Barfield calls dashboard knowledge of the world. That is, we know by carefully isolating our observations and our experiences exactly how the world will behave in relationship to us. When we encounter the world, when we behave in the world, when we do stuff to the world, we learn more and more through science how that process is going to go. We learn nothing, though, about what would happen if we weren't around, right? Because if we weren't around totally explodes all our categories, all our ways of talking about stuff, and that is by design. I'm going to read to you one more passage from Lewis to close out this journey through Barfield. So you guys know I like to keep healthy, I like to work out a lot, and that is why I'm so excited to tell you about our new sponsor, Field of Greens. There's a lot of talk about supplements, especially among people that lift weights, but just generally in the wellness and fitness space. And I have been really choosy about what kind of supplements, if any, I was going to bring to you as a sponsor, because there's so much gunk out there and it can get really gross and weird. For those of you that have asked, yes, I am natty, which is internet slang for natural. I do not take steroids. And that's actually why I really love Field of Greens, because one of the things that is really hard to incorporate into your nutrition is this, doctor recommended 6 cups a day of veggies and fruits. That is so much vegetables and fruits. I do not have time to pound that while I'm also pounding like protein and meats and stuff. So Field of Greens fixes this problem. It's a full spectrum of essential vegetables and fruits, plus science-backed herbs and prebiotics that you need to stay healthy. It works fast. You will have more energy. You will look and feel healthier. It's great for your skin. And if you're trying to lose weight, it can help with that too. So join me in taking Field of Greens. You can get 15% off for your first order and another 10% when you subscribe for recurring orders. A really good deal for Young Heretics listeners. Visit fieldofgreens.com and use promo code Heretics. It's fieldofgreens.com, promo code Heretics. So as you all know, I think, the Inklings were not just philosophers. They were not even just poets, but they were very into writing fiction. And of course, we have the Lord of the Rings. What is it even called? The like Silmarillion adaptation. The Rings of Power. We have the Rings of Power currently on TV, which I have to confess that for my sins, I have seen. And by seen, I mean I've watched the first half of each episode and fallen asleep through second half. I am so sorry to be a spoil sport here. I too, like everybody else, I want to like modern TV. I want to like modern pop culture. There's a lot of stuff in modern pop culture I really do like. But I have to call a spade a spade. This stuff is such dreck. Like even the Game of Thrones one, which I kind of like. This is a bit of a tangent, but I am going to come back to my point here, Ray, vis-a-vis the Inklings. Even the Game of Thrones sequel or whatever, I like it. It's fine. It's whatever. I'm not like, enthused about it, but it just all seems so derivative. Like, do we really just have to like bring our plates to this like giant vat of slop, of undifferentiated slop that's like digested and rehashed from like a book that's been made into a movie, into a TV show, into a whatever, and just like they just sort of slap it onto our plates, and it's like, yes, thank you, like more gruel. I'm sorry, like I find this stuff so empty at this point, and I really find the Lord of the Rings thing empty because of what it does to the character of Galadriel, but that's maybe a story for another day. I just think Galadriel was already powerful and beautiful and intense. Like you did not have to make her a sword wielder. She has like incredible magical powers that are some of the most riveting parts of the original Lord of the Rings. Anyway, all of this is, I bring all of this up because, of course, the Lord of the Rings itself, which is not derivative or boring or dreck or any of that stuff, is the work of an Inkling, J.R.R. Tolkien, whom we have not been talking about, but who was obviously very close with Lewis. Lewis famously writes the Narnia series. He also has this space trilogy, which we have covered in some depth and detail on this podcast. And that is kind of what I wanted to close us out with here, is this passage, interestingly, in the space trilogy. When we talked about the space trilogy, I was raising the idea, right, that all of these novels kind of bring to life in narrative form the truths that the Inklings were arguing for in their nonfiction. And Barfield, by the way, has one of these as well, a Silver Trumpet. But Lewis's space trilogy, I think, is the best fiction he ever wrote. And you can lift passages out of it and see exactly which nonfiction they correspond to. There's lots of stuff in it from the abolition of man, or perhaps you might say that the ideas in the abolition of man are also all over the space trilogy. There's lots of stuff that you can recognize from the problem of pain, and there's stuff that you can recognize from Barfield. And there's a particularly interesting kind of exchange that they have between the angels and Ransom, the main character. So the angels, or the Eldila, they're called, these sort of planetary beings who watch over planets and correspond in some ways to the ancient gods, the kind of polytheistic gods, but also have angelic presence and power. Right? They encounter Ransom at the end of book 2, Paralandra, which is after the kind of New Eden has been rescued, and they need to present themselves to him. He needs to encounter them in some way that he can see them, and the other beings, the other sort of human-like creatures on Paralandra can see them. So he encounters these sort of angelic beings. They're beyond humanity, but they're also conscious, right? And they have a kind of consciousness that's beyond anything that that we can imagine, and yet they also have an important role to play in our lives. They go through this fascinating process at the end of book 2, where they try to make themselves known in a more concrete way to Ransom. Previously, he's sort of seen them as this little disturbance in the light, or kind of vague glistening. And then here's what happens. The very faint light, the almost imperceptible alteration in the visual field, which betokens an eldiel, vanished suddenly. The rosy peaks and the calm pool vanished also. A tornado of sheer monstrosities seemed to be pouring over Ransom. Darting pillars filled with eyes, lightning pulsations of flame, talons and beaks and billowy masses of what suggested snow volleyed through cubes and hexagons into an infinite black void. Stop it, he yelled, and the scene cleared. He gazed round, blinking on the field of lilies, and presently gave the Eldila to understand that this kind of appearance was not suited to human sensations. Look then on this, said the voices again, and he looked with some reluctance, and far off between the peaks on the other side of the little valley there came rolling wheels. There was nothing but that, concentric wheels moving with a rather sickening slowness one inside the other. There was nothing terrible about them if you could get used to their appalling size, but there was also nothing significant. He bade them to try yet a third time. And suddenly 2 human figures stood before him on the opposite side of the lake. So then he encounters these beings as kind of humanesque, man-like, as Lewis might say, beings, creatures. And then they have this exchange. But do I see you as you really are? He asked. Only Meleldiel sees any creature as it really is, said Mars. Meleldiel is the name for God in these books. How do you see one another? Asked Ransom. There are no holding places in your mind for an answer to that. Am I only seeing an appearance? Is it not real at all? You see only an appearance, small one. You have never seen more than an appearance of anything, not of Arbol, not of a stone, not of your own body. This appearance is as true as what you see of those. But there were those other appearances. No, there was only the failure of appearance. I don't understand, said Ransom. Were all those other things, the wheels and the eyes, more real than this or less? There is no meaning in your question, said Mars. You can see a stone if it is a fit distance from you, and if you are at moving at speeds not too different. But if one throws the stone at your eye, what then is the appearance? I should feel pain and perhaps see splintered light, said Ransom, but I don't know that I should call that an appearance of the stone. Yet it would be the true operation of the stone, and there is your question answered. We are now at the right distance from you. And were you nearer in what I first saw? I do not mean that kind of distance. It's a wonderfully elegant way of dealing with all the stuff we've been talking about, right? That these angels have a being, right? They have a being which is concrete and specific, and they are one thing and not another. And yet, like everything in the world, we have only ever seen an appearance of them. Only Meleldiel sees us as we really are. This is the, I hesitate to call it hubris, although it is hubris in a certain sense, right? This is the hubris of our scientific idea that we can get a God's eye view. The kind of view that Ransom wants in this passage of the angels is the God's eye view. Only Meleldiel sees us as we really are. And perhaps, God's vision of creation is to be able to see and contain in God's mind, in his mind, the indeterminacy that we describe with our quantum equations when we refer to things outside of human perception and observation. But our minds don't contain, there is no container in your mind, right, for the God's eye view of something outside of any individual human perspective. It's not that there's no such thing as fact or objective truth. It's that those objective truths always come to us mediated through a human experience. Your human experience is not some, arbitrary, subjective brain fart. It's not just your opinion, man. It's not just something that will eventually be rendered obsolete by, computer artificial images or, high-tech renderings of certain, of data, right? You are not going to be replaced by a machine for the reason that the whole existence of creation is in the relationship between a consciousness and whatever it is that is out there, right? You are in that relationship, and your memories, your thoughts, your desires, your experiences are not only important, they are part of the creation of the world. They are part of the image of God in you, and ultimately they are the way in which you encounter God's world, not just as a lump of inert matter or various lumps of inert matter making contact with one another, but as a language that speaks the being of God in every sentence that is its being, right? I mean, everything that it is, creation proclaims the glory of God, and this is how it does it. This is why Barfield, to me, is just like, you could be with him forever. We've been with him now for 3 weeks. We're going to bring this, I think, to a conclusion, although we may return to him later. Who knows? I strongly recommend reading both Poetic Diction and Saving the Appearances. There's other stuff too that's really good. Worlds Apart is really interesting. And like I say, you can get it all in pretty good editions now on Amazon from Wesleyan. Let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, which is a forum outside the reach of big tech. Every day, it seems like in the news, there is more evidence to the effect that these companies like Facebook and Twitter and so forth have, if they weren't already parastate entities, they have morphed into these kind of, into this sort of conglomeration with the state. And what they are doing in collaboration with entities like the FBI is they are trying to shut down speech that the government deems inappropriate. Besides being unconstitutional, that is wrong. And since it is wrong, we have a duty as Americans to find ways to subvert it at every possible turn. That is why Locals is so important. That's why I'm on Locals and why I hope you will join me there at youngheretics.com/locals. You can become a VIP and you will get all sorts of extra goodies. We all love goodies. It's not super expensive to join for the full year. You can also do the monthly the monthly membership as well, and you get a weekly Q&A with me where you can ask any sort of questions you want. I'll do a live stream every week on Friday. You get extra essays that you can only access as a VIP. You get a translation and commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans, which is pretty baller as well, if I do say so myself, and lots of other stuff too, book reviews and so on and so forth. So youngheretics.com/locals. Here is a mailbag question from Young Heretics VIP Peter. Did ancient Near East pagans truly believe that their wood or stone statues of gods were in reality the gods themselves? It seems like the visible representation of an invisible reality abstraction is rather easy to make, but that might just be spoilers from the success of the work of Maximus the Confessor. You can see why I've chosen this mailbag question for this episode. It is weirdly opposite to everything that we have been talking about, right? That basically one of the things that I've been arguing via Barfield is that this distinction we have between visible and invisible reality. We believe in all things, right? Visible and invisible. It's true that we believe in all things visible and invisible. It's even true that there are visible things and invisible things. But it's not true that the starkness of that demarcation was always so apparent to everybody, Jewish or pagan, right? Regardless of whether you believed in the one true God or you believed in an idol, right? There was a sense in which these two kinds of reality, this physical presence, the encounter with the physical world, and then the spiritual realities or the abstract or the higher realities that encounter conveys and gets across, right? Those two things were tightly interlocked together. And so when you say, like, was worshiping Baal, was that like a kind of, were you worshiping human sacrifice? Was worshiping Mammon the same thing as worshiping wealth? How does this work exactly? A little bit of everything, right? This is like when Isaiah says, he has a passage where a guy goes out and chops down wood and creates a sculpture, and half of the wood he uses to warm himself, and then the other half he bows down to as if it were a god. And one of the things that Barfield points out is that frequently in the Bible, if you worship an idol, you become like the idol, which has eyes but does not see, has ears but does not hear. And this is the curse that God puts upon also those who disobey him, right? Why would that be? Well, it's not that the Jews didn't also have, they made no graven images, but they did have physical spaces where they worshipped and so on and so forth. It's that they were constantly being encouraged to understand these images as inviting them into a relationship with something which ultimately was only ever going to be mediated by the physical representation and never actually, embodied in the physical representation. And it's not necessarily that the pagans, had no concept that the god might exist above and beyond the statue that they had. It's that the things that statue was supposed to deliver, supposed to offer, were themselves lower than God, were more fleshly, had things like money, success, war, right? This is why now when we talk about idols, we talk about setting up earthly and material gain as the highest good, because the whole gesture of idolatry, which is still the reflexive gesture of the human heart, even if we no longer set up, the same kinds of stone statues, right? That whole gesture is to take a thing which conveys goodness to us and to identify it with goodness per se. So I do think that, some ancient religions were more complex than just to be like, this is where the God lives. I mean, not all were, some, but take Greek religion, for instance. There's plenty of very sophisticated Greek thought about, where does the God actually live? Do they occupy the place of the statue? To just stand in for it? But the nature of idolatry is to confuse the vessel, confuse the word, confuse the flesh, confuse the matter for the thing which comes to us through the matter. And that's Barfield's understanding of idolatry. It's to collapse what is it's sort of irreducibly composite reality, form in matter, and the relationship between the two, this Trinitarian truth about how reality is constructed and what it looks like, to collapse that into just a pure identification of, well, this matter has this, is the good, is the God, is the thing that I should worship and pray to. If I do this physical gesture, then the rain will come, or what have you. It's not just primitive, it's actually primordial. It lives, it's something that we constantly do because we are the kinds of creatures that we are, because we experience the truth, because we experience high things that are beyond, that are metaphysical in the physical, fleshly here and now. Constantly have to be avoiding confusing the flesh with the thing that comes to us through the flesh. And that's in some ways what the whole practice of Jewish religion taught in antiquity, was to disambiguate those two things. That's it for me. I will see you next week for more. We're going to move on from Barfield. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. You can go to claremont.org/donate to help support us. We are a think tank that works and writes and thinks in defense of the American idea, to recover the American idea, the ideas and the principles of the founding. Urgent work and work we love to do. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, both online, and the CRB also has a physical copy, which you can get in the mail if you subscribe. One more time, it's claremont.org/donate to help support us. And I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.